Iron Rock State Penitentiary, Arizona Desert. 1,400 hours. The heat in Arizona doesn't just cook you. It cooks the hope right out of your marrow. It was a dry, dusty oven that smelled of diesel fumes, cheap disinfectant, and thousands of sweating men living in cages. The transport bus hissed to a halt inside the Sally Port. Chains rattled. "Listen up, ladies!" The CO, correctional officer, bellowed, spitting tobacco juice onto the asphalt. "Welcome to Iron Rock. You are no longer in the county jail. You are in the House of Pain. Get off the bus. Eyes forward. Mouths shut." Frank Sullivan shuffled off the bus, the leg irons biting into his ankles. To the naked eye, Frank was nobody. He was 62 years old, with thinning gray hair, a slightly stooped posture, and a face that looked like a crumpled road map. He moved slowly, coughing into his fist. He looked like a librarian who had made a terrible mistake with his taxes, or a grandfather who had forgotten to pay a parking ticket. He looked weak, and in prison, looking weak is a death sentence. But the naked eye misses things. It missed the fact that Frank's stoop was actually a coiled, relaxed stance, ready to spring. It missed the way his eyes didn't dart around in fear like the other fresh fish, but instead scanned sectors. Tower 1 sniper, 300 yards. Gate B electric mechanism. Guard on the left, overweight, distracted, sidearm unsecured. Frank wasn't a librarian. Frank was a retired Master Chief Petty Officer of SEAL Team 6. He had operated in Panama, Somalia, and places the U.S. government still denies visiting. He was in prison because he had finally snapped and broken the neck of a man who hurt his granddaughter. The state called it manslaughter. Frank called it pest control. He was here to do his time and die quietly. He had zero interest in prison politics. But prison politics were about to take an interest in him. The ecosystem, processing was a blur of humiliation. Strip search, squat and cough, shower with water that smelled like rust. Frank was assigned to cell Block D. General population. Gen Pop. Block D was a concrete canyon echoing with screams, laughter, and the slamming of steel doors. It was a human zoo. Frank was shoved into cell 209. His cellmate was a skinny Hispanic kid, maybe 20 years old, shaking like a leaf. "Yo, you the new guy?" the kid asked, sitting on the top bunk. "Bottom bunk is fine," Frank said softly, tossing his thin mattress onto the metal slab.
"I'm Luis."
"Grand Theft Auto," the kid offered. "Frank," the old man replied. He didn't offer a crime. He didn't offer a handshake. He just started making his bed with military precision. Corners tight, blanket smooth as glass. You look old, man," Luis whispered, looking at the door. "You gotta be careful. Block D belongs to the Vipers. Dante Reyes runs this deck. If he sees you, if he thinks you're weak." "I'm just here to do my time, kid," Frank said, lying down and staring at the ceiling. "I'm not looking for trouble."
Luis laughed nervously.
"In Iron Rock, trouble looks for you." The butcher. 2 days later. The cafeteria. The noise level in the chow hall was deafening. It was a sea of orange jumpsuits. Frank stood in line holding his plastic tray. The menu was mystery meat loaf, watery corn, and a dry biscuit. He shuffled to a table in the back, near the wall. Tactical habit. Never sit with your back to the door. Never sit in the middle of the kill zone. He sat down and picked up his plastic spoon. Suddenly, the noise level dropped. It was like a wave of silence rolling across the room. Frank didn't look up, but he felt the shift in air pressure. The predators had arrived. Dante the Butcher Reyes walked in. He was a monster of a man, 6'5", tattooed from neck to knuckles. The ink on his neck read Viper King. He had done time in federal prison for racketeering and decapitating a rival gang member. He walked with a swagger, surrounded by 4 lieutenants, his soldiers. Dante didn't wait in line. He walked straight to the front, took a tray, and turned around, scanning the room for entertainment. His eyes landed on Frank. The new guy, the old guy, the easy target. Dante smirked. He walked over to Frank's table. His shadow fell over Frank's food. Frank kept eating his corn. One spoon at a time. Dante slammed his fist onto the table. Bam! The plastic tray jumped. "Hey, Pops!" Dante sneered. His voice was deep, gravelly. "You're sitting in my seat." The entire cafeteria watched. This was the ritual. The alpha wolf testing the new sheep. If the sheep bleated, it was over. Frank slowly chewed his food. He swallowed. He wiped his mouth with a napkin. Then he slowly looked up. He looked at Dante's chin, then his throat, then his eyes. Target analysis. Steroid abuser. Dilated pupils. Right hand dominant. Center of gravity high. Left knee scarred, old injury. "There are 20 empty tables, son," Frank said. His voice was calm, almost bored. "I'm almost finished." The room gasped. Nobody called Dante son. Dante's face twitched. He leaned in close, smelling of rot and expensive contraband cologne. "You think you're funny, old man? You think because you have gray hair? I won't spill your blood." Dante reached out and grabbed Frank's biscuit. He crushed it in his hand, crumbling it over Frank's head. Crumbs fell into Frank's hair and onto his shoulders. "This is my house," Dante whispered. "You pay tax to breathe my air. Give me your tray. Now." Frank looked at the crumbs on his shoulder. Inside his mind, a switch flipped. The civilian mode turned off. The operator mode booted up. Scenario A. Drive the plastic spoon through his eye socket. Fatal. Scenario B. Throat punch. Crush the windpipe. Fatal.
Scénario C. De escalade.
Gather intel. Wait for a strategic advantage.
Frank chose scénario C.
He wasn't ready to go to the SHU segregation/hole yet. He needed to know the layout of the prison first. Frank stood up slowly. He picked up his tray. "You must be hungry," Frank said. He gently placed the tray in front of Dante. "Enjoy the meatloaf. It's a little dry." Frank turned and walked away. Laughter erupted from Dante's crew. "That's right, Grandpa. Run away," Dante roared, throwing the tray at Frank's back. It hit him, staining his jumpsuit with gravy. Frank didn't flinch. He didn't turn around. He just kept walking, counting his steps to the exit. To the inmates, Frank looked like a coward. To a trained eye, he looked like a predator resetting the ambush. The green light. Back in cell 209, Luis was panic-stricken. "Are you crazy, Frank?" The kid paced the small cell. "You disrespected him. You called him son. But then you walked away. Now he thinks you're a punk. That's worse. He's going to put a green light on you." "Green light?" Frank asked, cleaning the gravy off his shirt in the tiny sink. "It means anyone can kill you. For a pack of cigarettes. For fun. Tonight. They'll come tonight." Frank stopped scrubbing. He looked at his reflection in the polished steel mirror. The old man looked back. But the eyes were shark dead. "Tonight," Frank repeated. He looked at the cell door. It was electronic. Could be popped open from the control tower. If the guards were on Dante's payroll, and in a place like this they always were, the door would open. "Luis," Frank said, "go to sleep. Top bunk. Face the wall. Do not turn around, no matter what you hear. Understand?" "Frank, we gotta bang on the door. Ask for protective custody." "I don't need protection," Frank said, sitting on his bunk. "They do." 2 o'clock hours. The kill squad. The prison was never truly quiet. But at 2 a.m., the rhythm changed. The breathing of the beast slowed down. Frank lay on his bunk. His eyes were closed, but he wasn't sleeping. He was practicing box breathing. Inhale for 4, hold for 4, exhale for 4. His heart rate was 45 beats per minute. Clank. The sound was subtle. The pneumatic lock of his cell door disengaged. The guards in the tower had accidentally popped cell 209. Dante hadn't come himself. He sent his hitters. Standard gang tactic. Send the low-level soldiers to do the dirty work. Frank opened his eyes. 3 shadows slipped into the cell. They were silent, wearing socks over their shoes to muffle the sound. They held shanks, sharpened toothbrushes and pieces of metal torn from bed frames. 3 targets. Close quarters. Low light. Frank didn't move. He waited until they were fully committed. Until they were inside the fatal funnel. The first attacker, a guy named Creeper, raised his shank to stab the sleeping lump under the blanket. But Frank wasn't under the blanket. He had stuffed pillows there 10 minutes ago. Frank was standing in the dark corner, behind the door. As Creeper brought the knife down into the empty pillow, Frank moved. He didn't move like an old man. He moved like a ghost. Frank stepped forward and grabbed Creeper's hair from behind, yanking his head back. Target. Carotid artery. Frank applied a sleeper hold, a rear naked choke. But he didn't just squeeze. He torqued the neck. Creeper went limp in 3 seconds, unconscious before he hit the floor. Frank lowered him silently. The second attacker turned, hearing the soft thud. What the? He didn't finish the sentence. Frank stepped into the light. He looked massive in the shadows. The attacker lunged with a knife. Frank did a check block, using his left forearm to deflect the knife arm, while simultaneously driving the palm of his right hand into the attacker's nose. Cartilage snapped. The bone drove up into the sinus cavity. The attacker dropped the knife, blinded by pain and tears. Frank swept the man's leg, dropping him, then delivered a precise stomp to the solar plexus. The man curled into a fetal ball, gasping for air that wouldn't come. The third attacker, a young prospect, froze. He saw his 2 friends dismantled in under 6 seconds by a grandpa. He held his shank with a shaking hand. Frank stood over the bodies. He wasn't breathing hard. He looked bored. You can leave, Frank whispered. Or you can stay. If you stay, I break your arm. Then I break your leg. Then I put you to sleep. The prospect looked at the open door, then at Frank. He dropped the shank and ran. Frank kicked the unconscious Creeper out into the walkway. He dragged the gasping second man out and dumped him on top. Then he picked up the shanks. He walked to the control booth camera, held up the weapons and dropped them on the floor. He went back into his cell and pulled the door shut until it clicked. Luis, Frank said softly. Why yeah? The kid squeaked from the top bunk, terrified. You can turn around now. It's clear. Luis looked down. He saw the empty cell. He heard the groans from the walkway. Frank? Who are you? Frank lay back down on his bunk and pulled the blanket up. I'm just an old man trying to sleep, kid. Good night. But the war had just begun. Dante the butcher wouldn't take this lying down. He had sent boys. Next time he would bring the army. And Frank? Frank was calculating the structural integrity of Dante's empire. And he had just found the first crack. The yard. 0900 hours. News travels faster than a shiv in prison. By breakfast, the entire population of Iron Rock knew that Pops in cell 209 had hospitalized 3 of Dante's soldiers without getting a scratch on him. The inmates had a new name for Frank. The Gray Wolf. Frank walked into the yard. It was a dusty, fenced-in square of dirt under the baking Arizona sun. Usually, the yard was segregated by invisible lines. Aryans by the weight pit, Black Gorilla Family by the basketball courts, Vipers near the bleachers. Frank walked right down the middle. He wasn't wearing his shirt. His torso was exposed to the sun. The yard went quiet. Frank didn't look like an old man anymore. His body was a map of violence. A jagged scar ran from his collarbone to his hip. Shrapnel, Afghanistan, 2002. Bullet wounds pockmarked his back. His muscles were lean, corded wire, not the puffy, steroid-bloated bulk of the convicts. On his left shoulder, faded but visible, was the trident, the seal eagle, anchor, and pistol. He walked to the single pull-up bar in the center of the yard. He jumped up and began to do pull-ups. Strict form, dead hang, chin over bar. 1, 2, 10, 20. He didn't stop. He was finding his rhythm. He was clearing his mind for what was coming. From the bleachers, Dante Reyes watched behind dark sunglasses. He was seething. His reputation was bleeding out. He could hear the whispers. The other gangs were laughing at him. He's mocking you, boss. Hissed Rico. Dante's right-hand man. Rico was a knife expert, a psychopath who sharpened toothbrushes on concrete until they were needles. "He's not mocking me," Dante said, his voice low and dangerous. "He's advertising. He's showing us he's not afraid." Dante turned to a corrupt correctional officer standing near the fence. He nodded once. The CO nodded back. The trap was set. The setup. "Sullivan. Cell 209. The loudspeaker crackled. Frank dropped from the bar. He had done 50 pull-ups. He wasn't even winded. "Report to the laundry room for work duty." Immediately, Frank wiped the sweat from his brow. Laundry duty, ideally located in the basement. No cameras. Loud machinery. Steam. It was a classic kill box. Frank looked at Luis, his cellmate, who was playing cards near the wall. Luis looked terrified. He knew what laundry duty meant for an enemy of the Vipers. Frank walked over to Luis. "Stay here," Frank said. "If I don't come back in an hour, don't go back to the cell. Get placed in segregation. Punch a guard if you have to." "Frank, don't go," Luis whispered. "It's an ambush." "I know," Frank said. A small, cold smile touched his lips. "That's why I'm going. I'm tired of waiting." The laundry room. 0930 hours. The laundry room was a cavern of industrial noise. Massive steel tumblers roared, shaking the floor. Steam hissed from leaking pipes, creating a hot white fog. It smelled of bleach and wet misery. Frank walked in. The guard who escorted him, Officer Miller, stopped at the door. "Get to work, Sullivan. Sort those sheets." Miller stepped out and locked the heavy steel door from the outside. Click. Frank was alone, or so it seemed. He walked to the center of the room, amidst the rolling carts of dirty linens. He closed his eyes for a second, filtering the noise. Clink. Metal on concrete. Behind the third dryer. Shuffle. Rubber soles on wet tile. To the left. Frank opened his eyes. "You can come out, Rico," Frank said, his voice cutting through the mechanical roar. "And bring your friends. All 5 of them." Shadows detached themselves from the steam. Rico stepped out, spinning a long, homemade knife, a shank, made from a lawnmower blade. It was 12 inches of rusted steel wrapped in electrical tape. Behind him were 4 Vipers. They held pipes, shanks, and a heavy lock in a sock, a flail. "You count good for an old man," Rico smiled. "Dante sends his regards. He said to peel your face off so we can see who you really are." Frank stood loose. His hands were empty. "Tactical error 1, Frank said calmly. "You brought knives to a gunfight." "You don't have a gun, old man," Rico laughed. "I am the gun," Frank replied. "The engagement." Rico land. He was fast, aiming for the gut to eviscerate. Frank didn't retreat. He stepped into the blade's arc. Frank's left hand shot out, parrying Rico's wrist. At the same time, Frank's right elbow smashed into Rico's face. The sound of breaking bone was sickening. Rico stumbled back, blood exploding from his nose, but he held onto the knife. The other 4 rushed in. Pack of wolves. Frank grabbed a heavy bag of wet sheets from a cart. It weighed 50 pounds. He swung it like a pillow. Wham! The wet bag hit the second attacker in the chest, knocking the wind out of him and sending him flying into a commercial dryer. The third man swung the lock in a sock at Frank's head. Frank ducked. The lock smashed into the metal cart, sparking. Frank grabbed the man's arm, spun 180 degrees, and used a judo throw, sui nage, to slam the man onto the concrete floor. Frank followed up with a heel stomp to the ribs. Crack. Man down. 2 left, plus Rico, who was recovering. Frank backed up toward the steam press, a massive machine used to iron sheets. "Come on," Frank yelled. It was the first time he had raised his voice. It was a command battlefield voice. It froze them for a split second. Rico wiped the blood from his eyes. "Kill him," they charged. Frank grabbed a bottle of industrial bleach from the shelf. He didn't throw it. He unscrewed the cap and splashed it into the face of the 4th attacker. The man screamed, clawing at his burning eyes. Frank kicked him in the knee, shattering the joint. Now it was just Rico. Rico was a killer. He didn't panic. He switched his grip on the knife to an underhand hold. "You're good," Rico spat. "But you're old. You're getting tired." Frank wasn't tired. His adrenaline was dumping, but his heart rate was controlled. Frank grabbed a metal laundry hook, used to drag bags. "Come get it." Rico slashed. Frank blocked with the hook. Clang. Rico stabbed. Frank dodged. They circled in the steam. Rico feinted low, then went high for the neck. Frank saw it coming. He dropped to one knee, letting the blade pass over his head. He drove the metal hook upward, catching Rico's wrist. He twisted. Rico screamed as the hook tore into his forearm, forcing him to drop the knife. Frank stood up, grabbing Rico by the throat. He slammed him backward against the hot steam press. "Who pays the guards?" Frank asked. He didn't yell. He whispered it right into Rico's ear. "Go to hell." Frank pressed Rico's face closer to the scalding metal plate of the press. "Who?"
P.
"The guards. Captain Miller. Captain Miller runs the block for Dante."
Rico screamed.
Frank threw Rico to the ground. 5 men down. Less than 2 minutes. Frank stood amidst the groaning bodies. He wasn't unscathed this time. A shallow cut on his forearm was bleeding. His knuckles were bruised. The door unlocked. Officer Miller walked in, expecting to see Frank dead. Instead, he saw Frank standing over his hit squad. Frank looked at Miller. The look was terrifying. It wasn't anger. It was a promise. "You're next," Frank mouthed. Miller panicked. He pulled his baton and hit the radio. "Code blue. Laundry room. Inmate assault on staff. I need backup." Frank smiled grimly. He put his hands behind his head and knelt down. He knew the drill. The goon squad riot team was coming. They would beat him. They would throw him in the hole. But that was fine, because Frank needed to get to the hole. That's where the ventilation shafts were weakest. And that's where he could get to the captain's office. The hole? SHU. 3 days later. Segregation. The hole. 23 hours a day in a concrete box. No light. No books. Just you and your demons. Frank sat in the dark. His body was bruised from the beating the guards gave him, but nothing was broken. Seal bone density is legendary. He wasn't idle. He was working on the vent. Using the metal zipper pull he had torn off his mattress, he was slowly unscrewing the security mesh. Dante thought he had won. He thought Frank was buried. But Frank wasn't buried. He was deployed. Dante Reyes was about to learn a lesson in asymmetric warfare. You don't fight the enemy's army. You cut off the head of the snake. And tonight, Frank was going hunting for the captain. Ventilation shaft, Sector 4. 0300 hours. The air inside the vent tasted of rust and dead rats. It was a metal coffin, barely 20 inches wide. For a normal man, it was a nightmare of claustrophobia. For Master Chief Frank Sullivan, it was just another confined space insertion. He crawled using his elbows and knees, dragging his body silently over the sheet metal. He had removed the security mesh in his cell using the zipper pull from his mattress. A tedious, painful process that took 3 nights of bloody fingers. Below him, through the grates, he could hear the prison breathing. Snoring inmates. The clink of keys. The hum of electricity. He wasn't trying to escape out of the prison. That would be too easy. He was escaping into the heart of the command center. He was going to the warden's control tower. Frank counted the junctions. Left, straight, down. He paused above a large vent. Light poured through the slats. Below him was the captain's office. He could hear voices. "I don't care how you do it, Miller." A deep voice growled over the speakerphone. It was Dante Reyes. "The old man doesn't leave the hole alive. Make it look like a suicide. Hang him." Captain Miller's voice answered, shaky and nervous. "Dante, the feds are doing an inspection next week. A suicide in the SHU looks bad." "You know what looks worse?" Dante interrupted. "Me sending a video of you taking my money to the governor. Do it. Tonight." Frank smiled in the darkness. Intel confirmed. He silently unscrewed the bolts of the vent cover. He had loosened them from the outside days ago during his cleaning duty reconnaissance. He waited. The hostage. Captain Miller hung up the phone. He wiped sweat from his balding head. He opened his desk drawer and pulled out a bottle of whiskey. He needed courage to order a murder. He didn't hear the vent cover slide open. He didn't hear the soft thud of boots hitting the carpet. Miller raised the glass to his lips. A hand, hard as iron, clamped over his mouth. Another hand seized his wrist, twisting it until the whiskey bottle fell to the floor with a dull thud. "SSH." A voice whispered in his ear. It was calm, terrifyingly calm. "Scream, and I snap your neck." Miller's eyes bulged. He tried to struggle, but the grip was absolute. He was being held by a machine, not a man. Frank spun the captain around and shoved him into his own chair. "Hello, Captain," Frank said. He looked like a demon, covered in gray dust from the vents, his eyes burning with cold intensity. "Sullivan, how?" Miller gasped. "You have a security flaw in Sector 4, Frank said casually. He picked up Miller's baton from the desk. "Now we're going to make a broadcast." Frank leaned over the control console. It was a bank of monitors and switches that controlled every door in the prison. "You're going to open all the cell doors in Block D," Frank ordered. "Are you crazy? That's a riot."
No.
"A riot is when people run wild. This." Frank leaned closer. "This is a town hall meeting." Frank grabbed the microphone for the PA system, public address. He flipped the switch to all sectors. The feedback whine screeched through every speaker in the prison. In the cells, the cafeteria, the yard. Thousands of inmates woke up. "Good morning, gentlemen." Frank's voice boomed through the prison. It was steady, commanding. It sounded like God speaking from the clouds. "This is Frank Sullivan. You know me as the old man in 209. In cell block D, Dante Reyes sat up in his bunk. His face went pale. "I am currently in the captain's office," Frank continued. "Captain Miller is here with me. He has something to confess." Frank jammed the baton into Miller's ribs. "Speak." Miller sobbed into the mic. I take bribes from the Vipers. I let Dante run the drug trade. I ordered the hit on Sullivan." The prison erupted, yelling, banging on bars. The illusion of Dante's power, that he was untouchable, was shattering. He wasn't a king. He was a rat working with the cops. "Dante Reyes," Frank said, his voice dropping an octave. "I'm coming down to Block D. Just you and me. No guards. No weapons. No soldiers. If you're the king, come claim your crown." Frank looked at Miller. "Open the gates." Miller, shaking, pressed the master release for Block D. Buzz. Hundreds of steel doors slid open simultaneously. The walk. Frank tied Miller to his chair with duct tape and left him gagged. He took the elevator down to the main floor. He walked through the corridors. The guards had fled to the perimeter, terrified of the mass unlock. The prison belonged to the inmates now. Frank entered Block D. It was a coliseum. Inmates lined the railings of the second and third tiers. Hundreds of them. Blacks, whites, Latinos. They were silent, watching the ground floor. The kill box. In the center of the floor stood Dante Reyes. He looked massive. He had stripped off his shirt, revealing a torso covered in gang ink. He held a heavy metal shank, a sharpened piece of rebar wrapped in leather. Behind him stood the remnants of his crew. But they looked hesitant. They felt the shift in the wind. The whole prison was watching. If they jumped in, the other gangs would slaughter them. This had to be one-on-one. Frank walked into the circle. He was unarmed. He wore his dusty orange jumpsuit, sleeves rolled up. He stopped 10 feet from Dante. "You talk too much, old man," Dante growled, swinging the rebar. "You think these people care about you? I run this place." "You don't run anything," Frank said. "You're just a bully who pays for protection. And your contract just expired." The showdown. Dante roared and charged. He was fast for a big man. He swung the rebar at Frank's head, a blow meant to crush a skull like a melon. Frank didn't block. He slipped inside the arc step. Pivot. Frank's movement was fluid, almost like water. The rebar whooshed past his ear. Frank didn't strike yet. He pushed Dante, unbalancing him. Dante stumbled and turned, furious. Stand still. He slashed horizontally. Frank ducked. He slapped Dante's face. Not a punch, a slap. A disrespect. The inmates on the tiers gasped. Is that all you have? Frank asked. I fought children in Mogadishu who hit harder than you. Dante lost his mind. Rage took over technique. He rushed in, swinging wildly. Frank decided it was time to end the lesson. He caught Dante's wrist in mid-swing. Grip, twist, snap. Frank applied a wrist lock kotegaeshi and torqued it with his entire body weight. The sound of Dante's wrist snapping echoed through the silent block. Dante screamed and dropped the weapon. But Frank wasn't done. He spun Dante around and kicked the back of his knee. Dante dropped to his knees. Now the king was kneeling before the old man. Frank wrapped his arm around Dante's neck. Not to kill, to control. He whispered into Dante's ear, loud enough for the front row to hear. A leader eats last. A leader protects his men. You sacrifice them. You are no king. You are nothing. Frank released the hold and shoved Dante forward. Dante, humiliated, broken, and crying in pain, looked up. He saw the faces of his own crew. They looked at him with disgust. He saw the faces of the rival gangs. They looked hungry. Frank turned his back on Dante. He's all yours, Frank said to the general population. As Frank walked away toward his cell, the mob descended. The Vipers, the Aryans, the Bloods, they all swarmed Dante. The scream was short. Justice in prison is brutal, and tonight the debt was paid. Epilogue, the ghost. 2 days later, the dust had settled. The FBI had raided the prison. Captain Miller was in federal custody, singing like a bird about the corruption ring. The warden was fired. Frank Sullivan sat in the yard, doing his pull-ups. He was still in cell 209. His sentence hadn't changed, but everything else had. No one sat at his table in the cafeteria, unless invited. When he walked down the hall, the sea of orange parted. Young gangbangers looked at the floor when he passed. He wasn't a gang leader. He didn't run drugs. He didn't charge tax. He was the gray wolf, the keeper of the peace. Luis, his cellmate, sat on the bench nearby, reading a book Frank had recommended. Hey, Frank, Luis asked. What was it like, being a SEAL? Frank dropped from the bar. He wiped his hands. He looked at the sun, blazing over the Arizona walls. It was a job, kid, Frank said, a rare, genuine smile cracking his weathered face. Just a job. But the retirement plan, it's rarely quiet. Frank picked up his towel and walked back to his cell. He had 5 years left on his sentence. It was going to be a very, very quiet 5 years. Because nobody, absolutely nobody, wanted to wake the wolf again. The end.